Welcome to the Contour office hours. Hi, everyone. This is a free-for-all, discuss what you want on how to use Contour, how to contribute to Contour, new features and things, and stuff that you've been working on. So, yeah, kick it off.
I put a discussion topic in the HackMD, and if everyone could click on that link, and I'll also provide one other reference here.
Put the link in the chat too.
Oh, give me one more second. One more second. All right, so if you look at the first link, you see that there's some best practices for. I just want to double check.
You want to share your screen, Daniel?
Sure. This is a link that I put in the chat window, right? The headless services.
Yep.
Right. So the reason I'm looking at this is because let me get rid of this. The Contour operator work. And right now, it's just kind of an interesting setup that we have for networking for Envoy, right? So we specify a container port and a host port. And when you specify a host port, the container port should match. But it's interesting because there's host networking isn't set here. And when this was discussed before, it was my understanding that this setup, networking setup, was so that east-west traffic, right? So traffic from pod A on node A can go to pod B on node B without going to kube proxy. And there's different ways to accomplish that without using host ports. And if we go back to this best practices, so headless services, I actually came across headless services because of this document. And let me put this in the chat window as well. Oh my gosh, where is the chat window now? Let me just put it in the HackMD. Or can I do that? Okay. Yes. All right, there's the other document. All right, so because of this interesting networking setup where it's almost like we're trying to like do host networking, but also you know, there's a service for Envoy. Come on, where's it at? There we go, Envoy. Service Envoy. That specifies external traffic policy, local ports, right? So, and it's a load balancer service. And this is kind of I guess a challenge if we go back and look at the host port definitions and this kind of best practices is when you specify, right? It says don't specify a host port unless it's absolutely necessary. And so I guess that is really the core of the discussion that I'd like to have is it absolutely necessary that we specify host ports? because, you know, in this document, you kind of see why host networking in general has these limitations. And really most of the Kubernetes documentation you're going to see, it's going to say, try and stay away from that, right? And there are other ways that we could potentially get around using the kube proxy, right? So when we use a headless service, we bypass kube proxy, and no load balancing or proxying is done. And so it's something that I'm kind of just testing out right now to see if we can get away from kind of this default networking setup that we have for Envoy, just because at least what I'm seeing is it's not consistent with like recommendations from the Kubernetes community. And so I'll kind of stop there, and if others want to provide their perspective or any kind of background, would be appreciated.
Yeah, I think you're fine. Sorry, I was late. I've been on Zoom meetings all day. I think yeah, we can totally switch around how we do this, and it's one of the reasons why it's called examples in the contour repo and not the production way to deploy, because knowing that people are going to have different ways to deploy, different requirements and stuff. That's kind of why it was too hard to come up with every different scenario and different sort of permutation of what folks might need. So yeah, we can definitely switch this around if we need to, and discuss it. I think you've got 2 points, especially since the upstream docs say, don't do this. The original goal was to reduce the churn in terms of east-west traffic across nodes. So when a request hit Envoy, we didn't want when a request hit a node port, we didn't want it to then travel east-west to a different node running an Envoy to then handle the request. That was the original goal of doing it this way. Also, some folks don't have load balancers in front. So again, but that's specific to that environment. So that makes sense.
And I put a link to a branch that I'm working on for the contour operator to do exactly what you're talking about, and that is to expose how network endpoints are published, and so that we can meet these different common use cases, right? Because as you mentioned, Steve, right, the examples is just that, examples, and it's like, okay, how can a user get introduced contour, set it up, and use it quickly, and so what I'm trying to do here is, let me go to compare and pull request here, is basically add to the contour API and expose this endpoint publishing, right? Where we can publish the endpoints for either contour or Envoy differently, right? So we may say, okay, for contour, publish using a cluster IP, right? And which is the default now, right? A service gets created for contour, and it's a cluster IP service, right? Or maybe there is a use case for not publish or for publishing it as a load balancer instead of a cluster IP. And then how do we manage the Envoy network endpoints as well, right? And you see here, as I'm starting to think through this, it's like, okay, well, I want to kind of keep the consistency with where it's at, so we'll default to cluster IP for contour, default to load balancer for Envoy, but we provide kind of a few different publishing types, right? Load balancer, pretty straightforward. Host networking, this would be more for like bare metal environments where a load balancer isn't available. You can either use host network or a node port service. And then a cluster IP, of course, exposes the network endpoint for either contour or Envoy using the cluster IP service. And then each one of these types, load balancer, cluster IP, for example, here, could have additional configuration options as well. But this is kind of the road that I'm going down, and I'm trying to kind of reconcile what exists in the examples today, and that's what brought me to doing the research upstream with Kubernetes and what are the best practices. And so I'm kind of just trying to stitch that all together. And I'm scratching my head because what we have in the examples, I'm like, okay, it seems like it's this kind of combination of different approaches bound together. So yeah, I'll.
I think there was an issue somewhere too, wasn't there? I remember, like Micaiah, you had some good thoughts on this as well about changing the something around to fix this as well. So I think, yeah, this, I can't remember if there was an issue, if there was a Slack or something.
Yeah, we have a Slack thread, and then I believe there is an issue in the Contour operator as well. I just don't recall what it is, and that is to, this particular feature essentially that I'm working on is, configurable network endpoint publishing is, I believe, what the issue's called. But if Micaiah's on, I'm not sure if there's anything you want to add as well.
I think you've pretty much covered it. I guess one thing I'll note is for the aim of avoiding east-west traffic, if you are using a load balancer service or a node port service, you can avoid east-west traffic by specifying the local external traffic policy on the service. And that was in the example that Dane showed. So you don't need to use host networking or host ports for that purpose.
Yeah. And then
sorry, Steve, what I determine is, even though that, to your point, Micaiah, right, you see in the examples, external traffic policy local is specified. And what I determine is the reason why host ports is still specified in the Envoy daemon set, right, is because of kind and the kind config, right? And so I tested this myself when I just removed this host port because it necessarily shouldn't be needed. Kind doesn't work, and as soon as I re-enable it, kind does. So this is kind of like this example configurations, like half like what you would expect in a normal production environment, right? With the service for Envoy that specifies external traffic policy local, so it's not going through a kube proxy hop. But it seems like this host port is added specifically for kind. So that's at least what I've seen so far in my testing.
Yeah, there are use cases for both, right? Host port or host networking. It makes sense with kind. It also makes sense sometimes with bare metal. But on a cloud platform, on a cloud environment, you're probably not going to want host port, host networking. You're going to want the load balancer service or maybe node ports.
And I think the reality too is if you deploy this, say, to AWS, you'll get a load balancer, which will point to a node port, which will then point back to the host port. So you get like this weird loop. Because I think the default cloud controller won't route to a host port.
Well, Micaiah, you bring up the bare metal use case, which does make sense. But what seems to be a bit off is, I would think with bare metal, like, yes, we would specify the container port, host port, but we'd also specify host network true, right?
Not necessarily. I mean, those are two ways to get almost exactly the same thing. You can say on the port, this should have a host port, or you can say on the pod, I think, that this pod should have host networking. And ultimately, you get almost the same thing. I think there's a little difference in the kernel configuration, IP tables rules or whatever. I was chatting with someone from our SDN team who was saying, if you use host port, there's an additional masquerade rule involved. So it's possible host networking might have some very slight performance advantage, but they're more or less the same thing.
Yeah, I think also today Contour is very static in terms of having two listener ports. You know, an HTTP and an HTTPS listener port. So that fits to the host port model in terms of exposing things out to the world. I think if you had more, if Contour did more like L4 or something, then maybe you'd want host networking to then expose these dynamic ports out to the cluster. But we don't do that, so it's not an issue today. So yeah, I think there's no reason we can't change this. To be honest, I think that helps also remove the need for privilege containers as well, right? Because for you to use those ports 80 and 443 on your cluster, you've got to have a privilege container. So that's part B of this as well. So getting rid of that would be great.
Right, that's a great point. Yeah, if you're on a cloud environment, there's no need for the additional permissions, right? Or if you're using a node port, or if you're using a load balancer service.
Yeah. So I think there's an issue in Contour. I think Mikhail, you opened it or someone opened it. I'm looking for it now. I'll find it, but.
I may actually have it referenced in the Contour operator.
Yeah, there was one there. I think. Was it operator or Contour itself? I can't remember now.
Yeah, there was something in Contour, and I believe that I referenced it here. Let me just find where.
The operator
Envoy pod
105.
is non-root. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's linked to from Contour operator issue 105.
Yeah, and everything we see here is my same experience actually trying to run Contour on an OpenShift cluster. Just kind of one of the reasons why I'm trying to dig into this issue and figure out, what's the best way to solve it. All right, well, yeah, I mean, I'm still playing around with this because I do want to figure out, like how can we use the operator, expose, what's needed for ease of use, right? Running Contour on something like Hind, but also being able to run Contour in a different kind of more production related scenarios.
I think if anything, this is there's a good FAQ on the deployment guide or deployment section in terms of to just discuss all this stuff we just talked about. I think it's great. So, like, hey, I'm in a bare metal environment. What do I want to think about? Well, this is what I'd want to think about. Oh, I'm in a cloud environment, like Mikhail, you said, and hey, here's what I want to think about. Here's things that you can tweak and not tweak, that sort of thing. So I think if anything, we can have a better explanation as to, like, they're called examples, which is sort of light-handed in the sense that, I feel like we don't give enough detail as to what you might want to do in your environment. So maybe if we have more concrete, explanations as to what the effects are in terms of different things, that would be helpful in terms of just deciding what do I want to do in my environment, in lieu of having all the different types of configs exposed out as examples. Does that make sense?
I was also expecting that the host port is kind of for the ease of development, that it has been at least very convenient when applying the example YAML and you get it automatically working with client. But then on the other hand, for the root, you can map the container port to something else, non-privileged, and still have the host port 80. Isn't it true?
Sorry, Taro, you said if you map to a different port?
Container port something unprivileged, let's say 8080.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But host port 80. So I mean, just for removing root, it should be possible
Yeah, yeah. I think you could use like the node port. If you define a specific node port for the service, you could expose that through kind or whatever as well, and that would still work. Envoy will still route regardless of the port in there. That's actually a fix that we changed. Actually, before Contour, the old Contour used to not do that. The port had to match your request, and now it doesn't. So you can definitely change that for sure. And it defaults to 8080 actually. If you see in here, I know Daniel, you have it up. We actually have flags that we override the default from 8080 and 8443 to 80 and 443. So if you take those Envoy service flags off, Contour will default to non-privileged.
I think host port requires privilege whether or not you're using a low numbered port. And if you wanted to use 8080 and 8443 with node port, I don't think that would be allowed unless you configured your node port range to include those ports. By default, I think it's 30,000 through 32,000 or so.
Yeah, you're right. I think I meant just like using like a 30,000 range instead of 8443.
Yeah, you could request a specific node port in that range. And for a kind cluster, you'd probably get it. I guess in production, there's no guarantee. Yeah. You might try to claim a port that something else already has assigned. But for kind, yeah, you could just request something in the node port range, and that would probably work.
Yeah. And so I'm kind of back to this PR. I'm hoping to avoid having, a publishing strategy here that is specific to kind, because I do think it's important that, we do provide an experience just like what we typically see here. But I'm hoping that maybe this host network strategy here will meet the needs of kind. So, just something that I'm working through now. And
host networking has then the side effect that it will the container will be sharing the networking namespace of host.
Yeah, maybe I need to have another option where it's just host ports instead of host network. Right, because that's essentially what it's doing here, right? Is it's just using host ports and not host networking.
I wonder if you can create like I'm just thinking out loud. As soon as you saw that, I was thinking of an endpoint class or something, and you can say like host, and then host would set different things for you automatically behind the scenes. But without having someone think about all this different stuff. But maybe that's too opinionated to do that. But you know what I mean? I'm thinking of like I'm in a cloud, my endpoint type is cloud environment or something, and then it would set certain things to then meet that kind of load balancer type and that sort of thing. But that's too opinionated to do that.
I was sort of thinking something similar, because I wonder if if you expose all the kind of granular toggles, whether users could set combinations of things that just aren't compatible with each other. So I think either you want some validation on there to make sure that can't happen, or the user gets feedback about it, or you kind of roll them up into these higher level options that encapsulate a few of these different granular toggles.
That's a good point. Like for Contour, if I set it to cluster IP, which it already does, and that's why this is just kind of a whip, because I like to kind of exercise the different options and see. But no, it's a good point. If there's any way that we could try to abstract away some of these details, more of a higher level abstraction, but it just seems like when it comes to networking, you always end up getting sucked into details to make the networking plumbing work. It just stinks. But maybe there is a way.
Yeah, I mean, that's how Contour started, right? The idea was to abstract that stuff away again, so folks didn't have to think about timeout policies and that sort of thing. But then inevitably other environments come along, and you've got to have different settings just because not everyone's the same. So yeah, no, it was just an idea. I don't know, something to think about.
Well, yeah, see if it's a good point, because even with load balancer, right? There's all sorts of little things you could do for the load balancer. And so, for that, it's like, okay, do you want the load balancer internal, right? Or do you want it to be an external load balancer, right?
Right, yep.
You know,
I think Knative does that. There's like an external one and an internal one.
mhm.
They'd want to set up for them if they wanted to use this for that. Yeah.
Yeah, with load balancers, it's really bad because you have different cloud platforms where, for example, AWS, you can specify the idle timeout. On Azure, you don't have that option, so it's difficult to give a good API that abstracts that stuff away because the option might not be there on one platform, might be there on another.
Right. And so when you look at the load balancer strategy, right, and there's the scope of, okay, what you want this to be, internal or external? I mean, I would expect in load balancer strategy that we have like provider specific parameters that can be set, to Micaiah's point, because all these cloud environments, they have, you know, different attributes that many users will want to manipulate. Like, I think even right now, right, there's the proxy protocol setting and so forth. And so it tends to be like, to satisfy all the different use cases, like you end up having to construct this kind of API. But definitely worth trying to figure out to see any which way we can simplify things while also supporting the different deployment options.
Does it even go as far as requiring to have some, let's say Azure specific annotations, and on the other hand, when you move it to AWS, then you need a different set of annotations on your load balancer service?
And I'd definitely like to avoid adding annotations to the Contour API, but to your point, essentially what a lot of the provider parameters would be here, right? So if there's another field, you know, even with this, right, with scope, it's essentially the implementation would be that the Contour operator creates the service and then specifies the appropriate annotation.
Exactly, because you own then the service object. It would be very hard for somebody manually then applying the annotations and trying to keep it up to date. It would be
and that's, the operator is taking care of that for the user, and now owns the Envoy and or Contour service. But yeah, to your point is, you know, in the background, what the operator is essentially doing is setting the annotations on the service.
That makes it quite difficult, of course, to make any kind of abstractions on top of that, because you cannot possibly anticipate every aspect like annotations in advance and make an abstraction on top of that.
Yeah, and hopefully it simplifies it a bit, you know, with the API design, where instead of a user having to know, okay, what annotation am I going to set, they at least just go ahead and say, okay, you know, for the type load balancer, I'm going to go ahead and for, you know, the load balancer, set the scope to internal, and it will, again, the operator in the backend will create the annotation for you. I mean, what this doesn't show though is, again, we need some way to specify, you know, a provider, right? Because the annotation would differ between the different cloud providers to create an internal load balancer.
Right. Somehow the operator has to know what platform it's running on. And so with OpenShift, we have config for that, but we'd have to come up with some way for the operator to look that up or figure that out. That's kind of another topic, but Dane, do we have an issue for that yet? I know that's something you and I have talked about, having some kind of plugin model or something to for the operator to get the configuration, cluster configuration, things like what platform am I running on? Is it bare metal or AWS or Azure, IBM, whatever? And then use that to get the cluster config, things like, wow. Do we have an issue for that yet?
No, we don't, but I just took a note so I can create it here after the call, and then I'll link it up to some of these other issues. But no, it's, I mean, I don't want to monopolize the whole call, but you know, is there value in even with a contour operator aside, you know, you know, for contour, understanding what type of environment that it's running on.
There were labels I was looking for. I don't think there are cloud provider labels though. There's like the OS and the architecture and the host name and that sort of things. The instance type. But
labels on the node?
Yeah, on the node. Sorry, yeah. But I don't know that there's a cloud. You could probably infer it based on like, you know, the type, but that would be kind of weird. I was looking for a way to do it automagically. You know what I mean? So if you looked at the node that's it's running on, but I guess, yeah. Sorry, I'm just talking out loud again. I'm gonna shut up.
Yeah, Kubernetes needs an equivalent to Etsy OS release.
Yeah, here, I'll put it in chat what I'm looking at. There are these labels. Because that fits into another thing that came up with Contour before about having like failure domains and stuff and be able to have, you know, envoys route to the same availability zones, that sort of thing. No, derail again. That's what I was thinking of though.
Yeah, so going back to what I was saying before about, Dan and I were talking about like having some kind of plugin interface for getting cluster config. But the plugin for vanilla Kubernetes, maybe it could try to infer things from these node labels, like you're saying, Steve. And then on other platforms, you might have richer configuration through CRDs or config maps to tell you the details that the operator needs.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you have a NUC lab at home, it's not going to show up properly and all those things. So, or some other kind of environment. Yeah, you'd want to be able to define all that stuff. Yeah, for sure. It'd be a neat trade-off though to have it auto-configure for certain common places to take that burden off of folks, not have to do it every time. But unless the plugin model could be templatized, and we could have it swap in somehow easily. Maybe that fits both worlds, where you could, you know, I'm on AWS, but I want to still determine how I get exposed. I want to use an NLB instead of an ELB or something, you know.
Yeah, that's another great example of, okay, even if you know you're on AWS and you want a load balancer, you configure an ELB or an NLB. That's the kind of thing where the platform leaks through, and it's hard to come up with an API where you have a where you don't have to expose platform details. You kind of do need to, if you want to make that option, that choice between ELB or NLB available.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's just bound to happen. At least, you know, what we've seen is the use cases come in, and you just can't get away from kind of managing provider specific configuration knobs.
So Dane, one thing I'm wondering is whether we really need the endpoint publishing strategy configurable for Contour. Are there any use cases where you wouldn't use cluster IP for Contour?
Just trying to think what if you did not want to create a cluster IP or create a service for Contour, or what if you wanted to expose Contour through a cloud load balancer? But no, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, others on the call, I mean, has there been use cases where, you know, exposing Contour through a service is not needed or different than how it's done through the examples today?
The only time I ever exposed contour differently was through some Gimbal things I was working on. So the use case was I had like 3 different upstream clusters, and I wanted to have an instance of contour in like a routing cluster. And that contour was the control plane for the envoys running in a different cluster. So in that sense, the envoys reached out to that the internal load balancer to go find its, XDS configuration. But that was just a PR on a Gimbal branch that we never really published anywhere. So
that does make me think of, let's say I wanted to offer a service, like a management service where Contour is running in the cloud, right? And I'm providing, I'm a service provider, and I'm managing customers' Envoy environments through their own kind of Kubernetes clusters, right? And so, Envoy management as a service, right? And so Envoy would need to go and connect out to Contour through a load balance service, but I guess no.
Contour still has to watch the API server too, so you need to expose the API server for everyone.
It would need to connect to a different Kubernetes API servers then.
Mm-hmm.
But what did you say, Steve? That in your case you still had one cluster or one API server in that example that you mentioned?
No, in my example, say you had like 4 clusters total, and you make one Kubernetes cluster a routing cluster. So the idea is that with Gimbal, the idea was that all traffic would hit one cluster, and from there you'd make a routing decision to where you would go. So think of that routing cluster as some sort of routing appliance or something.
Right. All the configuration was still in the routing cluster.
Yeah, and then from there, you would have. So what I was trying to solve was, like in Gimbal today, you need routable pod IPs. So when a request hits the routing cluster, and then say when it routes to an upstream client cluster, those pods in the upstream cluster have to be routable, which for a lot of people is not a reality, right? People don't have that. So a way around that was my design was to have an envoy running on the edge of every upstream cluster, or a set of envoys. So all the routing would still come into the routing cluster, but then there'd be a contour in there which would be configuring the envoy in that upstream cluster, which knew about the endpoints in that specific cluster. So requests would hit the routing cluster, and then it would route from that envoy to an upstream envoy. And then that upstream cluster could then route to your direct endpoint. So it was a way to get around, IP networks. That was the idea. But then you'd have all of your routing still central to one place. So the idea was that your upstream cluster didn't have to deal with any other configuration short of deploying Envoy, and everything else was still living in that routing cluster. So that was the idea.
I want to make sure I understand that correct, Steve. Is it accurate to say that the underlying use case that you're describing is where a Contour is running in a different cluster than Envoy that it's managing?
Yes. Here, I can show up a picture if that helps.
Which that would make sense, right? Because there needs to be some type of external service. This could be a load balancer service, typically a load balancer service, right? For Contour, or it could be a node port service, something that exposes Contour outside of the cluster.
Yeah. So this is the example. So this big top gray box was Gimbal, and then underneath you have different clusters. So here's a Kubernetes cluster, and here happens to be an OpenStack cluster. But just think of that as Kubernetes today. So the idea is that you'd have all your routes come into here. So this top cluster is the routing cluster. So it's just it could be your whatever routing device you deploy. And then in each upstream cluster, you put a set of envoys. So you have envoy here in Contour's cluster, and then also envoy up here or down here in these other clusters. So then these envoys in these other clusters, which are a whole different set of clusters with different API servers and everything, they would look back to this routing cluster for a Contour instance to tell them how to do the routing, right? So this cluster would watch all the upstream clusters, knows about all the endpoints up there, and then it would configure them appropriately for whatever route you wanted to have.
Just out of curiosity, the envoys running in the Gimbal cluster, do they exist there just for local proxying to like the Gimbal monitoring and other workloads running in the Gimbal cluster?
No, so they're actually doing routing. So what you do is, so say you had, so the idea here is like, say you had your domain, so stevesloco.com. I'd point it to the load balancer running these envoys in this routing cluster. And so once I get all of that set up to this routing cluster, then I can change where that stuff goes. So I could say route everything to this cluster here, cluster A, and then if I want, I could bring up a new cluster and then load balance across clusters or do a blue-green deploy between them or something. So it gives me the ability to switch things around quickly and easily, because the software-based load balancer now, which is Gimbal, is easily configurable through through Ingress. So no, yeah. So what happens? A request would come in, would hit one of these envoys in Gimbal, and then that would decide where to go. It would say, oh, I'm going to route to this other cluster. So it would hop between this envoy to the envoy in the upstream cluster, and then to the pod directly. Again, that was the PR branch that I was talking about. Today with Gimbal, it's got to route directly to an endpoint, so there aren't upstream envoys. Again, which is hard to solve for everyone. Is that clear? It's hard to explain. I don't know.
No, I
need better pictures.
It makes sense to me.
Yeah, that was the use case.
The picture.
Yeah, it's only the only other way I've ever exposed Contour differently, because these ones had to go look up for a different endpoint. But
right, and I mean, to me, just the underlying use case is when Contour is running in a different cluster or just somewhere outside of the cluster of envoys that it manages.
Mm-hmm.
Right, those envoys need to get back to Contour, and if they're not running in the same cluster, then a cluster IP service for Contour is not going to help out, right? So,
yeah.
You could expose Contour like you did here with a load balancer service, and it could be a node port service. I mean, that's a possibility as well.
Mm-hmm.
But most people, right, are going to use a load balancer service. But yeah, I guess back to Micaiah's question. I mean, Micaiah, it does sound like that we need to consider managing the network endpoints of not only Envoy but Contour for this type of use case. Even though it's uncommon, I think it would be common enough where someone would potentially want to manage envoys in different clusters where the Contour runs.
Yeah, just because the use case exists, we don't necessarily want the operator to cover it. I mean, we might want to invoke the Pareto principle and support 80% or 90% of use cases. But something like this, it just sounds more complicated than we really want the operator to need to deal with, because now you're talking about, well, not only are you exposing Contour's endpoint, but this means the operator isn't managing Envoy because Envoy is running on another cluster, right?
Right.
I think I figure out certs and all that too. I would hold on this and wait for people to ask about it. Wait for the use case to come back up again. I'd leave Contour out of this, like Micaiah is suggesting. I think leave this out of there, and then when more people need this, then I would look at adding it back. But yeah, it's a great point. Yeah, because you're not going to manage the lifecycle of Envoy then, unless you can reach out across clusters and do that, which I think is outside the scope of what this is intended to do today.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. Yeah. So then if the endpoint publishing is really focused on Envoy, right? And how do we want to expose Envoy? Do we want to do host networking? Do we want to do load balancer, host ports, so on and so forth? I guess I need to figure out the API of like, how do we get the API right for doing what we need today with Envoy, but also what happens if in the future we do say, well, we want to be able to change how Contour, we don't want to use a cluster or a cluster IP service for Contour. That's where I need to kind of figure this out.
Contour used to deploy too in the same pod with Envoy. That was day one. We used to, because we didn't have security between Contour and Envoy, we didn't have certs. So they just talked over localhost. So every instance of Envoy had an instance of Contour. I'm not saying we should do that, but that's another model that we used to deploy into, and it avoided having that communication and certs and all that other stuff. So, not to be confusing. Sorry, Mikhail, were you going to say something? I think I cut you off.
Well, I don't want to.
Go ahead.
Yeah, your point's interesting, Steve. I wonder whether that would be useful as an additional publishing strategy. So if we wanted to discuss that, then I don't want to cut off that discussion.
Right, because if we look at what I'm working on right now, right, I mean, endpoint publishing, and we're basically saying, okay, we can manage Envoy and we can manage Contour. You know, I can just essentially get rid of this whole struct, but then that would leave us in a position that if we eventually did want to manage the Contour network endpoints, then we'd have to expose that through spec.
Yeah, we could have something like start with just an Envoy endpoint publishing strategy field, and later, if we really decided we needed it, we could add a Contour endpoint publishing strategy field alongside it.
In spec.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, the thing I was going to say before was, I wanted to go back to something that Tero said, which was, sounded like there was some concern around using host networking, putting the Envoy in the host's network namespace. But you need the same privileges. I think it's the same privilege for host ports or for host networking. So I'm wondering, is there a concern with using host networking that doesn't exist with using host port?
But in case of host port, you still have a namespace for the pod, network namespace for the pod. So it is isolated from the host, except for that single port. It cannot, for example, reach the processes that are running on the host via the network directly, the local network, local host. So if this is just an imaginary example, but if you consider, for example, this deployment model where that Contour started with, where Contour was running inside the same host, or well, inside the same pod with Envoy. So kind of the idea there was then that it is okay because it's local host. You do not expect others to get in there. So in the same vein, there can be something running on host. I mean the Kubernetes worker node that kind of expects that nobody can access that root network namespace. So if pod is configured with host networking, I think it will be directly part of the like the worker node host like the root namespace.
Yeah, so host port might give you a little more isolation there. I wonder how much of that is real. Like, if you have the privileges to use host port, that might give you a way indirectly to kind of break out of your network namespace. I don't know. I have to think about that.
Yeah, I mean, one aspect is that can you can you deploy a pod with host port? That is like one aspect. But then another one, that what are you running inside the pod, the process Envoy running there? If there is vulnerability there, what can that then access? And if we have a host networking enabled for the pod, I think all of the processes running within the pod are able to connect to any local host port, any process that happens to be listening on the local host of the worker node. On the other hand, if we only have like a host port, then there will be still, I believe there will be still like the pod will have its own network namespace, so it cannot reach any other processes than the ones that are listening in that pod. It's an isolated network namespace, but then one port from the container is mapped to the host. The worker node, the host OS would still be isolated. We just like give the administrator who deploys this pod the privileges to map this single port or 2 ports in this case.
Yeah, I think host ports breaks network policies and all that kind of stuff because you can't define it now because it's on the host. I think that's how some of like the mesh, the traffic folks built this thing called Mesh, M-A-E-S-H, something or other. I think they use like a daemon set in every node to be like the sidecar proxy in a sense. So instead of having a sidecar in every pod, they have a sidecar on the node. I think the pod hits localhost, and then that daemon set responds to be like the sidecar like Istio might do. So I don't know. I know before I tried to write network policies for Envoy, and you can't do it because it's with host ports at least. Maybe but that was years ago. Maybe it's different now.
I think that is true for both host port and host networking.
Okay.
Well, I guess it'll depend also on what your CNI plugin is.
Yeah. Cool. Does that clear things up with what we were?
Yeah, I mean, I understand the distinction, the issue there with using host networking versus host ports. I guess now I'm wondering, is it a big enough concern to warrant expanding the API to have both options, or would it be better to have host port instead of offering host networking as an option?
To me, the host port seems, I don't know the reality of how less restrictive it is, but it seems less restrictive. You're only exposing specific ports, but that's all the Contour needs today. We only need to expose 2 of them. I think if you didn't, then we would expose other bits to the world, like the admin web page and stuff. I think it's only this thing on localhost.
But that localhost means that localhost becomes the localhost of the worker node also. When they are sharing the same network namespace.
Yeah, I just want to make sure we don't introduce some sort of CV. I'm good at doing that. I did that before already. Because in Envoy, there's that admin web page, and we bind that to like 127.0.0.1. So I think it's still hidden. Even if I think if you expose that port to the node, I don't know that it would still, like if you hit the IP of that node, I don't think it would still respond because the listener is listening on 127, not 0.0.0. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So
that's okay. I just want to be careful that we don't expose more than we need to by doing host networking. You know what I mean? Because that's going to expose everything in the pods.
Yeah.
Or the
I think there is like two directions in this from security perspective. That what are we then exposing more if it would be host networking from Envoy, but also on the other direction, that what can be accessed on the worker node. So we can think it as protecting the worker node or what is running in localhost of the worker node, and protecting what is running in our pod, in Envoy pod. And I think that it's like using host networking is more like a bigger violation, and in that sense that if we have a service that is deployed on the cluster that uses host networking, then it practically becomes more like something that is running on the worker node directly without being isolated in namespaces.
I
Of
think
course,
sorry, go ahead, Dara.
yeah, of course, it's only the network namespace, so it's. But you still can reach like this example that if you kind of assume that localhost is secure, like we almost always do, then that is already also violated when you kind of have this pod that is assumed to be not running on the local host of the worker node.
Right. So to me, there's a few action items that we can take out of this, right? One, I think, is to describe, should we change our default example to remove host port? I think we can do that by removing host port and then having that, that was a cluster policy thing. I can't remember the name now.
Yeah, and that's what I'm testing right now because
external traffic
right
policy.
now
That's it. Yeah.
Because right now host port, as I mentioned, is required to get the getting started example to work on kind. So I'm going to test out again the Kubernetes documentation that it really recommends not using host network or host port. It says use headless service if kube proxy load balancing is not required, which it sounds like that's kind of our main use case, is to get around the kube proxy load balancing. So I'm going to see if I could do this headless service stuff, and if that works with kind, then I will proceed with kind of a PR, and we can kind of look at that and discuss it some more and make sure that everyone's on board with that switch.
Yeah, I think I'd rather have Contour be the default, following the right patterns and the right security models out of the gate, and then the exception is, I'm in a bare metal environment and I don't have a load balancer and I want to do this other thing that's different. Then it's like, all right, cool, we can change it and let's do that and go down that path. You know what I mean? So I think one is, what you're talking about, Danian, of deciding what to do there and then actually doing it. And then two, I think, is just documenting these different deployment strategies. You know what I mean? So I'm in a bare metal environment. I probably want this. Here's how I could do that. Here's the trade-offs. I'm in a cloud environment, blah, 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 blah. Here's what I want to do. And then what's the third one? I had three things in my head.
Local development environment, so again, that kind of goes hand in hand with the getting started guide, right? I mean, I could go ahead and switch things up and it's like, okay, here's the perfect defaults and how you go ahead and deploy to bare metal or cloud environment. But then it's like, well, this doesn't work on kind and we need to address that. So I think that's just the balancing act that we have, is how do we continue to make it easy for local development, which I love how, when I first got into Contour, just being able to follow the getting started and guide and get everything up and working and actually create the example workload and test it. And not only, that's what we're using for CI as well. So we need to continue to support that. I mean, right now where I'm at, I just kind of exercising these different ways of doing things, doing research. And then I think even before I submit this PR for the API change, I think this probably necessitates a kind of like a design doc that we make sure everyone gets a chance to review and comment, and because this is going to affect not only the operator, but of course, the recommended or example deployments of Contour. So I want to make sure everyone's on board.
Yeah, I'd like to get Nick's thoughts as well. I know he's out this week, I believe, but get his thoughts, on this. Steve, do you have any thoughts? Steve, Chris, anything you think about?
No, I mean, I think, I basically agree that like using the host port thing is super helpful for development. I've always wondered about it as well. And it seems like if it makes sense to switch that and get to something that's a little bit closer to production ready as kind of our default out of the box example, then yeah, we should do it. So yeah.
Cool. And I mean, I guess with the right tooling, we can always expose multiple YAML files that do different things, like maybe the getting started is I'm getting started on kind or something, and that deploys it with host ports, but I'm getting started on a cloud provider. Then here's how you do that,
Yeah, and I mean, I totally get the desire to not have to maintain multiple, mostly identical but slightly different sets of YAML files. So yeah, without tooling, it makes sense to just pick one and go with it. But
what I like about the quick start today is that it's just like a single file. You can just like control apply. What I don't want to get into is like, oh, you need a queue builder and you gotta set up these configs and do all these different things, or a Helm chart, or even the operator. Like, I gotta go grab this thing and then configure this thing and then deploy that thing. And then when there's like more than one step, I think it's hard for getting started to work for folks. It's nice to be able to just run one thing and then it works, out of the gate.
Yeah, and Steve, that's kind of what I was thinking too. Is like I'd like to avoid having different like rendered manifests for kind and other environments. I think it's maybe like our backup plan so that we don't have to, maintain multiple getting started examples. So
maybe that's just tooling. And I know James before had a bunch of queue builder scripts that would manipulate the contour. So maybe we need to bring those back and then just have tooling use those just internally to build out those generated files or something. Then no one's doing it. It's just the CI bot doing it for us, I guess. I don't know.
Dane, one question. You linked this headless service page, but my experience with headless services has been only that the difference is that you don't get the virtual IP you for your internal service. You will get instead you will get a bunch of DNS names. I mean, one DNS name with a bunch of IP addresses, the cluster IP addresses. But do you see somewhere here in the documentation, was there something specific to headless services exposed externally?
I don't, and I'm pretty rusty on the headless services, and that's why I'm kind of diving into the documentation. Yeah, my understanding is, headless services basically a service of type cluster IP with a cluster IP specified as none, and so that bypasses kube proxying. But I still don't know what some of the limitations are. And so,
for example, if you define firstly, if you define a service and you make a DNS lookup, you will get the IP address, the virtual IP address of the virtual IP address, which will then be mapped or routed to the actual cluster IPs of the pods, the endpoints, and that virtual IPs is then managed by kube proxy. But if you then turn it headless and you make the same DNS lookup, you will get a number of cluster IPs directly. That is what I've seen. So it kind of just avoids of having that virtual IP allocated for the service, and it will directly map into the cluster IP. So that for example, let's say that when we have non-headless, or what is the word for that service, then load balancing is done within kernel via the virtual IP. But then if you have a headless service, then load balancing is just based on the DNS lookup that it returns you a random IP address. But
and really, my interest with the headless service is to support the kind scenario, right? Because it's kind, right, and getting rid of the host ports.
yeah.
And so what I've seen right now with the examples is, okay, we've got a service for Envoy that is set up to work for like in a load balanced environment, as if, you know, if you're running on the cloud. But it's also using host ports, which you normally wouldn't do that in a cloud environment, right? You just use the dynamic ports associated or created, and the load balance service would load balance to whatever those ports are for the pod. So really, I mean, my interest in this headless service approach is like, would that meet the needs of kind? So we can get rid of host ports.
I doubt that, but yeah, since I've never seen headless services mentioned in any kind of external connectivity. I might be wrong, but I never seen that. And the load balancing that is referred here is for the internal connectivity, I believe. When pods are connecting to a service, it will be like when you have a number of pods behind the service, and then you have a client, also a pod within the same cluster, then you go to the virtual IP of the service, and it will be load balanced by kernel networking. Instead of headless, when you have a headless service, then you lose this. You will have this DNS lookup return in the cluster IPs directly. So there is no load balancing as such at all. But both of these are just scenarios of internal connectivity within the cluster. But if you find something, then of course it's good.
I was sort of thinking that for the kind use case, we should be able to use a node port service. Like if we make the Envoy service a node port and then just do the mapping from your host to the appropriate port, then that should all work without using a host port.
Yeah, that's what I was actually going to show.
I think that maybe the challenge is I'm trying to remember node port services. Can you specify a node port, or is it dynamic? Because of this mapping here that we see on the kind config, right? Go ahead.
You can request a specific node port, and if it's available, it'll give it to you. So you know, you could have a static one in the manifest and just assume that it's going to be available.
Yeah, I think you have to expose the port up front in kind. Mm-hmm. Again, maybe a little bigger.
And then that would have to match whatever the node port you specify in the node port service, right?
I think so.
Yeah,
so
I think so.
So here, what I did was I have host port 30,002 on my local Mac, mapping to port 80 in the container, which that's probably not what we want. We probably want something else, right? Because we don't want to use host port.
Yeah, so I would think that container port, maps to whatever you choose for the node port of the service.
It's funny how this is so fast, yet it seems like it's so slow. I'll make this big so y'all can see.
Yeah, it's funny that these days this is the thing that we spend most time staring at, waiting for.
It's like, come on. I've been on Linux because Linux, this happens like twice as fast. Come on, there we go. So I have, Docker PS, I should have one port, 30,002, 30,002. So then what I need to do is have, where am I? Whatever certman is. So if we change all of this to be Envoy, right? Let me take this out. Can I delete it? All right. Host port out, and host port out. And then we want to change the service, right?
Yep.
To be something else. So like node port 3002. So now I can kube control, apply. I'll do it here. Yeah, so now port 80 is exposed on 30,002. So if I apply -f site examples, and then I should be able to now skip pods, see if they're good.
Put on 3002.
Once contour becomes healthy and happy, then yeah, I should be able to curl local.project contour.io : 30,002 and it'll work. It's not as cool as the port 80. Yeah, we'll do this and then we can move to your question there, Michael. Okay, so then
Can you just do a quick deploy of the card example and then curl it, or did you already do that?
yeah. Oh, sorry. There you go. So I have just there's a demo in the example in the example site that I use all the time from a blog post.
Okay.
That's just becomes my go-to. All right, so now I should be able to curl this : 30,002. It should work. And we're not using host ports. But you've got to have all that known ahead of time. Yeah. Which is the problem. Not the problem, but you got to know which ports to expose from kind.
Right. It's fine from a dev perspective. I mean, we could pick one random high numbered port and odds are it'll be available and things will just work. But yeah.
And maybe even just document it to say, I guess we don't want it. All right.
But
no, this is good stuff.
Yeah, I think for dev, I think we could have like a kind config that uses host port still and then make it quick and easy. I don't know.
And you can still make it to map to port 80 on the kind config, so the Docker still can map it if you want to avoid
right.
the port number in the curl command. So
yeah, you could. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think what Tara, you're saying is we could change this container port to still be 80. And then your host wouldn't have to expose a privileged port on your local machine. Yeah.
I'm always confused which way is it, host port or container port that needs to be 80.
Yeah, the container port is in the kind cluster, and then host port is on your local machine.
Yeah. Actually, I'm using it. I meant it in that direction that I would like to have port 80 on my machine, so that I can use. On my development machine, so that I can use curl without the port number with the default.
In that case, then wouldn't it be the host port here is 80 and then the container port is?
Yeah, but anyway, you can do whatever, and it doesn't need to be the same port. In my environment, I also put listening address to something like 127.0.100.1 or something. Then I can have several clusters. They just need to have a different IP address. And then I use as host names, I use the whatever are those services like xip or xip.io. I don't remember those services. I don't use the local.project contour, because that would always map to only 100, only to localhost. If I have several kind clusters running on localhost, I can have like different IP addresses there.
Cool. So I think that was a good discussion. I think we got enough things to think about. I think, so I think that's cool. So thank you all for everything. That was great. We have those 3 action items. I think we can poke on now. So Daniel, you're going to work on that first part, and we'll go from there and see what everyone thinks. So I think that's great. Michael, you've been patient. I don't leave you alone. You said you wanted to chat about extensions.
Yeah. So here's what we've come across. So this extension documentation came out of an issue that I raised ages ago, and I can't remember the original. I think it was an issue raised on GitHub. But the challenge we've currently got is we're rolling out 1.10, which includes 1.16.0 of Envoy at the moment, and I think there's a CVE patch 1.16.1 that's coming.
Mm-hmm.
And as part of your example configurations, you point to the Envoy container on Docker Hub, which is based on an Ubuntu base. But for historical reasons, we've been using the Alpine base Envoy image. And we have a process where we onboard that into our internal systems. And as part of that, it gets scanned for security and all the rest of it. But we wanted to switch to the non-Alpine image for a variety of reasons. One, the Alpine stuff is nasty hacks to get, to run glibc C programs in on a muscle sort of base, and the provenance of that Alpine container is random to some individual's, forked repo, all the rest of it. Plus, we're just not huge fans of Alpine. But the problem is, when we go to import the Envoy image, it fails our CVE scans because it's based on 18.04. And I understand that's an Envoy issue to some extent, but why I wanted to bring up this documentation you have is the original ask out of this was, can we build our own Envoy inside our firm, that is not a kitchen sink, that has all of the non-needed extensions compiled out of it, and then run that on our own base. So therefore we bypass all of this, bringing in external images and code. And so I know we had a lot of back and forth around this, and I don't think we ever got to the point where this was like a programmatically tested list of things that must be enabled in order to run Contour. So that's the background. And so I just wanted to try and pick this up because I think that we're sort of stuck using the Alpine import for the time being. We don't want to use that. We can't use the Envoy import based on Ubuntu. We really want to get to this. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, I haven't touched this in a while. I think I actually did this initial list whenever ago it was. And I think I just took out all the things that didn't need to be in there. Like there's a lot of those, like the MongoDB and all those other, features that, aren't required, and all like the logging frameworks. I'm forgetting the names now of all those different people.
There's a bunch now. There's Skywalker, Datadog, AWS, X-Ray. There's a huge number of extensions.
So I think I compiled this in my own custom Envoy and then ran it, and then Contour ran fine. We could do that test again. I don't think things have changed. I know we added the Lua here because we have that built-in Lua script.
Yeah, I know, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, which before we had out, so that's in there. But we could do it again. I know James had did a PR to Envoy to at least for testing it would work, but you can actually disable these at runtime.
Yeah, there was a lot of confusion about that. I tried to make it clear to James that doesn't solve our problem because the compiled code is still in the binary. The idea is not to have the compiled code in the binary at all. So that didn't solve this at all.
No, yeah. I guess I was saying it's an easy way to test though. Maybe it might be able to understand like, if I turn off all these, Contour still works, and we know that these are the valid extensions. Obviously, and then point B, I think you're going to still want to have that, recompile those out so they're not even there. So 100%. Yeah, I understand that. Yeah.
Okay.
It's just maybe it is an easy way to test, but because it doesn't take zero amount of time to build Envoy.
Yeah. So, I guess my ask is, it would be interesting, Steve, if you can cast your eye over this list again. Obviously, the number of extensions in Envoy grows like crazy. But you shouldn't have to worry about those. But I guess just cast her over this and see if there's anything you think is missing or that we need. And then, you know, I'm happy to do some testing and we can put it in engineering clusters. But we'd really like to get to, you know, our own compiled non-kitchen sink version done internally on our base.
Sure.
And then I'll talk to our, you know, VMware account team to ensure that, you know, we're kosher from a support point of view on that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that'd be good. Yeah, I'll do this again. I'll review this again for you.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah,
I mean,
no
I got a pretty good view, pretty good sense of what's required and what's not. But like, you know, for example, cause, right? You just added cause. I don't know where the cause is. Oh, cause is there. Okay. Yeah. So anyway, it'd be great. Thanks, Steve. That's all.
No worries. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Maybe
And one other question while I'm here.
maybe the authentication filter might be missing. I don't see it.
Which one?
For authentication and external authentication. But
Yeah,
I
good
don't
point.
know the name exactly. Outs or something like that.
That's a good point. Yeah. Is that that is an extension? Yeah. Yeah.
You know, the other thing too is I think that Envoy gzip has been deprecated for the decompressor compressor filters. That's another one I'd check, I guess.
Okay. I know we switched to using we switched from the well-known types to the typed configs for some of those filters because they change all the time and we kept getting broken. So yeah, we should be using in 1.11 that's going to come out. It'll use the typed
stuff. Okay.
The typed filters, the HTTP filters. Sorry, it's been a long morning. Yeah, so instead of using the well-known names. So yeah, we should be using the new one, the compressor type.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay, but yeah, let me double check this because that's a good point. That's a good point, Tara, too. Thank you for the
it is
for the auth bit that got added. Yeah, so yeah, and I'll add this to our deployment list too. I think we need to have an internal check to verify this list again when we do release, just because, you know, obviously we did auth and we didn't think to update this, so we'll put a note there to double check this every release as well.
And I also don't think you need the stats sync anymore either because it's all Prometheus, right? I think that's a stats D extension.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, if we only expose Prometheus.
Anyway, so let's look up. One other question. You mentioned Gimbal before, Steve. Mm-hmm. You know, where we need something like that and there's not a huge amount of activity on the repo. Like, what's the current status of Gimbal? Is it still alive and being used and being developed, or is it sort of, you know, stagnant?
Yeah, we haven't done much with it, as you can see. I have to talk to some other folks here at VMware what else we might do with it. So I think it's still, I think folks are still using it out in the world. But I don't know that we haven't done much with it, obviously, since then. But yeah, I can ask again, or if you have folks, if you want to poke, you can ask as well.
Okay.
To see as well. Yeah, I mean, I was doing some updates to it recently just to update some things, to keep it up to date, I guess. And I pushed a PR for my at last KubeCon. I gave a talk on using Gimbal, and I have a discoverer for vSphere. So you can go discover VMs and then pull those into your Kubernetes cluster to then route to them. So
okay.
It was a talk about how to bridge from, like, you know, have a multi, like a meshy kind of routing like you would get with Istio without having to deploy Istio or some sort of mesh. I guess I'm not picking on Istio specifically, but so you can use Contour and Gimbal to do all that kind of work. That was the idea. So.
Yeah, I mean, we currently have obviously a bunch of clusters now, and we have our internal, what we call a GLB is like an F5. It's not a load balancer at all. It's just a DNS updater. It's terrible. And so we are looking at the space of proper load balancing across clusters, which Gimbal is one of a number of different options. So just trying to assess, you know, how viable it is.
Yeah. The big thing we need with that is just that non-routable pod requirement to be solved, which we talked about initially. I would assume, you know, unless you have routable pods everywhere, which I doubt you do.
No, we don't.
Yeah. So, but I think that's easily solvable. Not easily, but it's solvable. It's just a matter of, you know, do we need to do that, and who's asking for it, and then to go from there, kind of thing.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Cool.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thanks, Michael. Yeah.
I got to drop actually, but thanks a lot.
No worries. Thanks, Michael.
I know.
Hey, Steve, just going back to this extensions list, I was
Yeah.
just curious historically if the Contour team has ever discussed shipping its own custom Envoy build.
No. I think that no one wanted to own that binary in a sense.
Yeah,
Because it puts
that's
it on
kind of what I figured. But
yeah. So there's nothing wrong with having all those in there unless you're, I think like environments like Michael where he doesn't want to have the overhead of having those in there because there could be other vulnerabilities that you don't know about. So,
right.
Yeah. So I know James did a PR to Envoy, so you can actually, there's a list you can pass to Envoy to disable these. And so what it does is when Envoy starts up, it won't execute that filter, or the extension, I'm sorry. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't remove from the binary. So it's still physically, compiled into the Envoy binary.
Right.
So the vulnerability could still technically be there. But it's an easy way to test if you don't want to have to, because recompiling Envoy takes a lot of love. It's gotten easier actually though, so not to scare people away. Actually, Sanjay, you should be able to help us with that because you are an Envoy compiling expert.
Yeah, it would be really nice if we got access to a remote build execution environment.
Yeah.
Then it would make all of our lives a lot easier for compiling Envoy. But
I did build it in GitHub Actions once. I think it took like 25 minutes or something, but it did it. So
yeah.
we could, do that and build it, but I don't know. It'd be nice to have it without all the extensions in there. That's what your point is, Steve.
I mean, it might be nice just for testing purposes, right? Because then we can make sure that this list is up to date. Like we can actually run integration tests against a version compiled with only this list. But I don't know if we necessarily want to publish it for users to consume. It seems like maybe that's, better off for them to have their own custom builds if that's the thing they want.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess we could,
Anyway, I was just kind of curious.
Sure. Yeah.
I'd be really interested, maybe this is too much to ask, but if for each option it were documented, why is this extension required? And in particular, I was wondering about the Lua one. That's really just for the HTTP2 go away, right? Or is it used for something else too? I could find the issue, or so there's an issue with if you have a wildcard certificate and multiple domains, if you because HTTP2 will reuse connections, you could have a connection to site1.stevesloco.com. And then if you open up a connection to site2.stevesloco.com, it'll reuse the first HTTP2 socket. And then what you end up with is a header mismatch based on the certificates. So what happens is it'll get reused, and you'll get the wrong response back from the wrong application because you'll be asking for, site 2, and you actually be sending it over site 1. So it actually goes to the wrong application, which is kind of weird. So it's actually a bug in Envoy. So I think we could either fix that, which we haven't done yet, or what we did was James wrote a Lua filter so that when it sees this, it returns a 421 back to the browser, which then tells the browser, hey, redirect you back to the original request that you did. And it's written in Lua. Yeah, that's what I was referring to. I guess, is 421 distinct from go away? I don't know. I guess maybe those are two different ways of doing the same thing. But yeah, that's what I was talking about. That's really only an issue with HTTP2. So, for example, if you're not using HTTP2, maybe you don't need that extension.
Yeah, if you didn't care about the filter, then yeah, you wouldn't need it. The problem is that Contour is still going to try and configure it. So you'd need some sort of way to say, hey, I don't care about that feature or that problem because it doesn't apply to me, and then have Contour not load that filter because right now Contour is going to try and spin up the Lua filter, no matter what. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Lua, is that enough? Yeah. So this would be the one, I think.
Yep, connection coalescing.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't say it, but this is really just an issue with HTTP2, or it's something. I mean, theoretically, you could an HTTP1 client could do this, but it's really something that only HTTP2 clients do.
Yeah.
It's kind of an unfortunate aspect of the HTTP2 spec, the whole connection coalescing thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think Safari still doesn't follow it properly, even with the Lua. I think it's still broken. I think there was something with Safari that was weird.
Yeah. So I think actually doing an HTTP2 go away response might work better. Although I don't know for sure that Safari would respect even that. But yeah, I remember there were issues. We've run into issues too where clients don't respect the 421 response.
I was looking for, I thought James had opened an issue in Envoy. I don't know where that is. We could see, but we could, the right thing to do is to fix it in Envoy. Maybe James has a PR. I'll dig into it and see if we can find the stuff for it. But you're right. Yeah, but we need a way just to disable that. So if we could say, hey, we don't care about this feature, then we could not load that extension, and we wouldn't need Lua in that list.
Right, and right, and document, you don't need this if you're doing a custom build, yeah. And I wonder whether there are any extensions that, well, so in the case of HTTP2, right, like you're saying, you can't just disable the extension because Contour tries to use it whether you need it or not, whether you're using HTTP2 or not. But I wonder if there are extensions that, well, like we're talking about gzip, you probably could disable gzip and it would work fine. And I'm guessing it was added to this list just because you kind of expect you expect Envoy to be able to handle gzip encoding.
Yeah, we set that, and that's a default filter that we add to the connection manager. Here in the listener. Whoops, let me make this bigger for you. So these are the default filters that we add. So we add this by default. And here, this is what I was saying, we use the typed config now. So before we used just a well-known name, which it changes in Envoy all the time. And Sanjay, you can back me up on this. But what we do now is we use this typed config. So then we can say, hey, it has to be this type URL, this is the protobuf URL type. So here's that new compressor one that we use. So now it should load that in dynamically. But we load this every time regardless. So the compressor, this gRPC filter we add, the course filter, and then the router filter, which is last. There are more, but like auth only gets added whenever it's used. So I wonder if we could do something like, I guess you wouldn't know if it's a wildcard cert. I'm trying to think of a way, could Contour know the situation comes up and then just don't load Lua until you need it, but maybe that's weird. But it would solve this problem easily what I don't want to have is this big configuration file of like things you got to tweak, which sounds bad.
In theory, it knows the certificate, so it could look if it's a wildcard certificate.
Like inspect the cert itself. Yeah, I think it'd be worth investigating to see. I mean,
but of course we can fix the bug in Envoy too. I mean, it wouldn't be necessarily worth of doing more workarounds.
That's true. Yeah. So I don't know. I know there are other requests to add Lua in. The folks wanted to write their own Lua scripts, so but again, that could be dynamic as well. As soon as you have a Lua script, then add the filter and go from there.
By the way, when you do the list of those filters, are you doing some grepping from the code directly, or I mean, isn't it possible to derive somehow what filters are referred from the code?
I think so. Let me see. Probably. I don't know.
Maybe part of those are something that are not directly referred but are still used. But
yeah, like things inside internal to Envoy. Yeah.
Mm.
I don't know. It's a good point. Yeah, it'd be great to just generate this list. Say, hey, this is what we're using today, and then just spit it out. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. Because it's not all in one spot. Like this spot here is these are the filters that are added to the HTTP connection manager, which basically gives you your HTTP endpoints, but these are filters, not necessarily extensions. They happen to be extensions as well, I believe. So I don't know. That'd be interesting to something to look at. Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah. And there is the naming scheme is kind of consistent. So if you get like a grep filter or something, that maybe you can do that.
Yeah, I don't know. But I think Steve has a good point too. If we could build our own list or build our own binary or something, and then just have the end-to-end test run against that. At least we'd find it. Like we would have found auth by now. So cool. Anyone else have anything else to talk about?
Maybe about you had started this design doc at some point for the HTTP proxy conflict resolution. Do you have any ideas there? I think it's still there on the it was with
Yeah, so the idea of this was when there are issues today where, like, say you there's a number of ways you can do it, but like if you basically create an invalid HTTP proxy, then what happens is it's marked as invalid, and then it stops serving traffic, so it gets thrown out, which is kind of counterintuitive to how we've explained the reason why we built the whole CRD to begin with. But for whatever reason, that's what it does today. So the idea here is to figure out when we encounter these different types of conflicts, how do we address them? So in some sense, if you, like, say you have an include to another resource, an HTTP proxy resource, in theory, if that include is invalid, there's no reason to invalidate the parent object, right? Because it can just it's invalid, or it has a warning because it has a bad reference, but there's no reason that it shouldn't be able to then not serve traffic still. Other cases I think I have, if you had, like, say you had two different services on an upstream, and one of the services is invalid, there's no reason to invalidate the entire resource. You could just invalidate that one service and move on. So the idea here was to have, invalid include, invalid route, to have different scenarios and then see how we handle those. So I know, Taro, you worked on having the service one return a 503.
And quickly I realized that there are so many different errors that you could do the same or something similar.
Yeah,
it became much bigger than I thought first.
Mm-hmm. So I started doing these, and then I got distracted by other shiny things. But I still want to get back to it. So at least having, like, the design done, and this is what Dave Chang and I talked about years ago when we started Contour, was having, like, a set of design docs written, and folks could just pick out parts, kind of like what you started working on, like the service bit. So at least if we can get the design part down, then folks don't have to go through all of this work. They can just go, here's how we decided to implement it, and just go implement it.
Do you have any opinions how to proceed with this? That should this be finalized, the design document first, or do we see some kind of smaller, like the only the service thing, or something that could be completed without having the I'm basically thinking that how to proceed. I got asked about this. My colleagues were asking. I bumped into a use case that I think that some of my colleagues are creating HTTP proxies, even if they don't have the services, and the services will be deployed some day later. So part of the services might be missing for a longer period, apparently. So this doesn't work at all now then, because the virtual host goes down completely.
Yeah, so I think we don't have to like get the entire design here figured out. I mean, we could figure out that use case in a sense, but ideally we would figure out, in my head, kind of when we do these different scenarios. So like they don't have to go together. You know what I mean? So scenario 1, scenario 2, and then the case you're talking about is invalid service or missing service. Here I think I broke it out as if there's only one service, have it return a 503, but if there's multiple, set weights and invalidate this one that's wrong, but the one that's good, give it all the traffic maybe or something. I guess the question comes, what if you already have weights or what? I don't know. There's different things we got to figure out, but just understanding what's going to happen for that, I think would be good to discuss first. And once we understand conceptually what the behavior should be, we can document it somehow in either it's this document or its own design doc. I think it'd be fine. And then, just go implement it. It'll be fine. But ideally we'd like to figure all these out, but I don't think we have to figure all these out to solve the one you're talking about.
Yeah.
In my head. Does that make sense, Steve? I mean, you've been here long enough now to. Go together.
Yeah, I think if there are isolated instances, then and it doesn't seem like we're going to paint ourselves into a corner by solving those, and that's fine.
One thing that maybe could be something that would cause problems later is that when starting this, I was a little bit wondering that because now they are errors, and if they would be warnings instead, then they are kind of hidden in. It's a change in the how the status is acting. It's a change how it has worked previously, and then all the kind of the all the missing services could cause warnings, and if only all of the services are missing, let's say if that would be a scenario, then we would have an error, and that error would need to say something else that now I think that it I don't anymore now recall it. I have had a too long break now concentrating on this, but I recall that I ended in a situation that I needed to change the error message that was there previously, because previously it errored in the first possible place, and there was like a good error message that pointed out what is the problem. Now that good error message would go into warning instead, and the actual error would only happen later when we then kind of have processed all the routes and concluded that there is no routes left. Still, the good error message went into the warning already. Do I make any sense?
Yeah, because it's in what order do you look for the different conditions and different problems? Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's gonna be the trickier part too. Yeah, in the code is figuring out, like, once we decide how it should work, and then it's implementing it, and as you walk down through that, through all the different resources, what do you do to?
And I was thinking that could it be even so that after going this design doc through, that we would change somehow how the status, like the framework, the code, how these are like reported, how it works, that so that we could still like walk it through in this logical way, but still somehow keep the more logical error message. I don't know, because now is it really good that I changed them to warnings now?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's the struggle in terms of, like you said, like if there is some sort of warning, then you've got to go look for it, and that was that alternatives here is like an emission controller to kind of be the best case scenario. Maybe, I guess, depending on what your users want to do, but if they added a service, for example, that didn't exist yet, then if you had an emission controller, it would just not allow that update to happen. So maybe that's better. Maybe that's worse. I'm not sure, again, because maybe your environment, you want it to be there, and then it'll just show up and start serving traffic once they're there. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I didn't really follow the logic how it works with my colleagues. I would need to ask for the details from them to understand why there is a situation that we have HTTP proxies, but not the services.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the most straightforward way it would be to have it as an image controller, so it just would get thrown out before it even could be added. You know what I mean? So if you tried to, if you added a root proxy that didn't have a domain on it, it wouldn't let you add it. Or if you reference a service that wasn't there, it wouldn't let you add it. Or if you added an include somewhere else that didn't match up properly, it would return an error back to you. That way you don't have to deal with these different scenarios and different problems because you couldn't add it. It would never be encountered.
That would require us to essentially take like all the DAG processing logic and put it into an admission controller, because it would have to go through and look across the board at everything.
Yeah, which I think we could do. We could just expose an endpoint in Contour or something. I don't know. It would need thought out.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think to me that's the best user experience in terms of how to do this. Because today, even if we solve all this, stuff's still going to happen that you may not realize as a user. You know what I mean? Which is kind of frustrating. So even say in your example, Taro, where you have a service that's referenced from a proxy that doesn't exist in the cluster, we could return a 503, and maybe your users start getting 503s all over the place. And they're like, why is this happening? You know what I mean? They don't realize that it's configured wrong or there's a typo or something. Today you're just going to get, you're not going to serve traffic. So which is worse? But I don't know. It's tricky.
Yeah, and there was also these corner cases with I think it was then with Ingress only, that there the problem was that the requests were kind of leaked to a wrong backend. Like if you would have a prefix that would otherwise somehow catch the requests coming in, but then when that was configured wrong, there is no backing service configured, but there is Ingress resource. I don't remember anymore. There is a ticket written by my colleague where it was explained, but the end result was that wrong backend got the request that would have been was meant to be routed to another one. It could even, in some strange scenario, it could be even a security problem if you kind of written your services in a way that you would never expect to expose a certain URL path from a certain backend, and then you misconfigure something and it is exposed. It's not probable, but it was surprising. So in that scenario, I absolutely would like to have a 503.
Yeah. Right. Rather than just having because the problem today is they're all path prefixes. So if I had /foo, then I have /foo/bar, and /foo/bar is invalid, then foo will take all of the traffic from /bar. Yeah. And this is important too, I think, as we look at doing service API stuff, that this is specific to HTTP proxy today, but in theory, some of these same issues can happen with service APIs and everything that we can need to think about as we go implementing that. I think I know Daniel and Makai, that's the next step. I think once we get the operator stuff up and running, we're going to want to start doing the service APIs work. But how do we address these things? I think Nick was working on some design work. I'm not sure where that is. I know he was out this week. But the same kind of problem with different names, I believe, in terms of service APIs, of if they map to things that don't exist, what does Contour do, and that sort of stuff. So if y'all want to comment on this, that'd be great. And Tara, if that helps, we can split this out into smaller pieces. If you want to just take the services bit, we can just talk about that specifically, maybe. I think that should still work without having to block us on talking about all of them. But from a code standpoint, we'll have to figure out some sort of pattern, I think, to have it set warnings or set errors or something. I know the original idea was to figure out all the different issues and set them on the objects. So you could look at show me the details of an object, and then the conditions, set of warnings and errors would tell you everything that's wrong with it. So, this service is missing, this route's misconfigured, this is blah, 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 before it's because, sorry, I'm talking too long today. But today it's one thing's wrong, you fix it, something else is wrong. You fix it, something else is wrong. You know what I mean? The idea is to show you everything up front in one list. So I think we can do that. We just need to figure that out in code. and go from there. But I think the biggest thing is understanding how do we want it to work? What is the expected behavior of contour when these different things are encountered, and then documenting them, in a design as well as in the docs somehow, somewhere, to make it clear that this is what's going to happen. So if you finger a service, you're going to get a 503, or maybe you don't get one or something. I don't know.
Yeah. I will try to think that if there is something that that I could continue with, and I will then ask in Slack.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks. Yeah, I know. I'm behind on these. I need to come back to them. This one, and there's another design I have for exposing more just status information, which is part B. So like if you have a bunch of includes and a bunch of other things, being able to understand from a child proxy what you've got included to that resource, because today it's not clear what you may have been passed from your parents. So I need to work on that as well.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I think we're just about out of time. Anyone have anything else they want to chat about? I'm looking at a calendar. When do we have the next?
Looks like there should be, the 17th.
17th. Okay, I just didn't know if it would hit Christmas or something, because the next one is New Year's. So we can have another one on the 17th, chat about stuff. And then what's the next office hours should be? I'm sorry, the next community meeting should be what, next Tuesday at 1 Eastern. Yeah.
That reminds me, I was going to ask, is there an actual calendar? All I know about is the community page, which lists, first, third Tuesday, second, fourth Tuesday, but doesn't really, it would be nice if there were like a calendar with, events, a calendar you could subscribe to.
Yeah, we can talk to Jonas. I know this happened with you, Sanjay. Did you ever get your invites, Sanjay, when you signed up? No?
No, I never got them.
So you're supposed to, and I'll talk to Jonas then about this, Mikhail. Supposedly, if you join this list, this user list, it's supposed to send you all the invites automatically, kind of like signing up for a SIG, and you get all the the invites and all the changes that way. So it must not be happening, because I know Sanjay did it, and then sounds like you did it too. So let me talk to Jonas and see what to do, because this list it comes from a Google group, a Google address somehow. So let me ask him, and then we'll figure that out.
Oh, I haven't subscribed to that list, so maybe that's the problem for me.
Okay. Yeah, do that maybe. Subscribe to this and see if you get them. Let me know, or ping it in the channel. I'm curious to see, because I know Sanjay did it, but he didn't seem to get the invite. So I want to make sure that that's working. That's all you should have to do, is just sign up for that list.
Cool. Thank you.
Can you post a link to that site you're looking at? I want to check. I'm probably not signed up for that list either.
Yeah. I think it's here off of the community page. There's this users list in the middle here.
Ah, gotcha. All right.
Yeah.
Yep. I know where that's at. All right.
Cool. Yep. And that should be the CNCF list there. Yeah. We have been posting, I think, like when we do releases and stuff, out to here. Oh yeah. See, here's the note, the invitations. So I wonder if it only happens when he changes them. Well, if you folks sign up, let me know. Sign up and then see if you get them or not. And if you don't, then we'll have to work on that, because I'm wondering if you only get the updates is when Jonas changes the invite somehow, and then the list gets emailed. That makes sense. I don't know, but we'll figure it out. Definitely need to get that figured out. So let me know, and we'll go from there. All right. Well, thank you all for chatting. This has been fun, and that's it. We'll have a good rest of your week. And I guess we'll see you on Tuesday at 1 for the next community meeting.
Yep, see everyone next week.
See you.
All right, take care.